L'Aravan had occupied the same corner of the observation deck for most of the 6-month journey aboard the Coalition training vessel Horizon. It wasn't that she preferred this particular spot. It was that this spot was the only place where her presence didn't make other cadets uncomfortable enough to leave. The view was spectacular. Stars wheeling past as the ship maintained its training circuit through Coalition space. Lyra watched them with careful attention, studying navigation patterns, calculating trajectory adjustments, keeping her mind occupied so she didn't have to think about the social isolation that had become her constant companion. Other cadets filled the observation deck during off hours, forming groups that laughed and studied and built the bonds that would carry them through military careers. They flowed around Lyra like water around stone, present but separate, acknowledging her existence only through the careful distance they maintained. The Nethara were rare in Coalition space. Her species had only recently been granted provisional membership after centuries of isolation, and Lyra was the first Nethara accepted into the officer training program. She'd hoped military merit would transcend the prejudices that had defined her people's relationship with the broader galaxy. She'd been wrong. The Nethara looked similar to several other species, pointed ears that expressed emotion through positioning, skin that shifted through colors reflecting inner states. But where other species' skin changes were vibrant displays, Nethara colors were muted, washed out, considered aesthetically unpleasing by galactic standards. More significantly, the Nethara were genetically sterile. A plague had rendered them naturally sterile thousands of years ago, and their entire culture had evolved around artificial reproduction and chosen affiliations rather than genetic lineages. Other species found this deeply unsettling. Most Coalition cultures were built around family structures, genetic inheritance, parental bonds, sibling connections. A species that didn't naturally form these relationships was viewed as fundamentally wrong. Lyra had faced this her entire life. When she'd been accepted into the training program, she thought competence might override prejudice. Instead, her classmates had rejected her through systematic exclusion. They didn't invite her to study groups, didn't save seats in lecture halls, didn't acknowledge her presence unless training protocols required it. She was functionally invisible. Even her success was treated as anomaly rather than achievement. Lyra's tactical simulation scores were in the top 5% of the class. Her physical training marks were exceptional. She spoke 6 languages fluently and had memorized Coalition tactical doctrine with perfect recall. None of it mattered. She'd stopped expecting anything different. David Park was human, which meant he was relatively new to Coalition politics and therefore less conditioned by its ingrained prejudices. He'd noticed Lyra's isolation. Hard not to notice someone who was always alone, but like everyone else, he'd assumed there must be a reason. It was easier to assume the isolation was somehow justified than to question why an entire cohort systematically excluded one person. It took 6 months of watching Lyra excel in every measurable way while being treated like she didn't exist for David to start questioning his assumptions. So one evening, instead of joining his usual study group, he walked over to Lyra's customary corner and asked the question no one else had bothered to. Why do they treat you like you don't exist? Lyra's skin flickered with surprised colors, muted yellows, and confused grays. She was clearly not used to anyone addressing her directly outside formal training contexts. "You don't know?" she asked. "Know what?" Lyra studied him, as if trying to determine whether he was being cruel or genuinely ignorant. Finally, she explained, "I'm Nethara. My species doesn't form natural family bonds. We have no genetic instinct for parental attachment or sibling connection. We reproduce artificially." Her skin shifted to resigned grays. "Other species find us unsettling, wrong at a fundamental level. So they exclude you because your species doesn't have nuclear families? They exclude me because I'm fundamentally unnatural to them. Most species base their entire society on genetic lineage and inherited connection. To them, we're not properly alive. We're aberrations that look like people but lack something essential." David paused. "That's idiotic." Lyra's skin flickered with colors he didn't recognize, surprise maybe at his bluntness. "Your species doesn't have instinctive family bonds, and somehow that makes you less capable as a tactical officer." David continued, Your simulation scores suggest otherwise, so does your combat proficiency. Sounds like their problem, not yours. Lyra stared at him like he'd said something incomprehensible. You don't find me unsettling? I find exclusion unsettling. Humans are pretty new to coalition space. We're still learning that different doesn't mean wrong. For the first time in 6 months, Lyra's skin shifted to colors that almost looked like hope. David sat down beside Lyra, which apparently was revolutionary enough that several passing cadets stopped to stare. He ignored them. Tell me about Nethara tactical philosophy, he said. Your simulations use approaches I haven't seen in standard coalition doctrine. Lyra hesitated, clearly unused to anyone asking her opinion on anything beyond required coursework. Then, tentatively, she began explaining how raw military thinking emphasized chosen operational bonds and mission-based cohesion, rather than units built around species or family affiliations. David listened, asked questions, challenged assumptions in ways that made Lyra actually engage rather than just recite information. By the time they left the observation deck 2 hours later, they'd sketched out a collaborative tactical approach combining Nethara strategic thinking with human adaptability. David started sitting with Lyra during meals, which drew attention and sometimes disapproval. He invited her to his study sessions, which made some of his regular group uncomfortable. He partnered with her during training exercises, which proved remarkably effective. Lyra's tactical precision complemented David's improvisation. When other cadets asked why he was wasting time with the Nethara, he responded by asking why they were wasting opportunities to learn from someone who consistently outperformed them. But something else started happening. A few other cadets, mostly from species newer to coalition space, less conditioned by its prejudices, began tentatively including Lyra. A Zelthari cadet named Kesri asked to review tactical scenarios with her. 2 humans from David's original study group started inviting both of them to collaborative sessions. A Vaindari named Thexvan approached Lyra about sparring techniques. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Most cadets remained uncomfortable, but the systematic invisibility began to crack. People acknowledged her presence, and some began appreciating her competence without treating it as strange anomaly. And Lyra, slowly, began to believe that maybe she wasn't fundamentally broken after all, just different in ways that some people could learn to see past. As training progressed, David started truly understanding what it meant to be Nethara. We're not emotionless or disconnected, Lyra explained during one late-night conversation. We just build relationships through choice rather than genetics. Other species assume that because we don't have instinctive family bonds, we can't form meaningful connections. But chosen affiliations can be as profound as inherited ones, sometimes more so because they're actively maintained rather than assumed. David thought about his own culture's concept of found family. Humans have that too. People who become family through shared experience and mutual commitment rather than blood. Lyra's skin shifted to muted but real hope. Your species understands that bonds can be real without being genetic. Some of us do. We're still figuring it out. But yeah, we get that family isn't just DNA. The training program culminated in a joint tactical exercise requiring mixed species teams facing complex scenarios. Lyra was assigned as tactical coordinator for one of the primary teams, a position that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Her team included David, Kesri, Thexvan, and 3 other cadets who'd learned to see past prejudice to competence. They performed exceptionally. Lyra's tactical brilliance combined with David's adaptability creating synergy that outperformed several other groups. After graduation, coalition officers approached Lyra about specialized tactical positions. The systematic exclusion hadn't entirely disappeared. Prejudice doesn't vanish overnight, but Lyra was no longer invisible. She was recognized, respected, and a growing group had learned that different doesn't mean less than. When reporters asked David what made him approach the outcast everyone else avoided, he gave his straightforward answer. I asked why. Nobody else bothered. They just assumed there must be a good reason. But sometimes the reason is just prejudice wearing the mask of social norm. Asking why is how you see the mask. Lyra, standing beside him, added. David showed that empathy doesn't require shared biology. It just requires choosing to understand rather than